This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. In this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, I take a deep dive into the first Department of Financial Services, that's State of New York, enforcement action around cybersecurity involving First American Title Company. In this deep dive, I'm joined by Jordan Arnold, Chief Innovation Officer at K2 Intelligence Fin, and Surjeet Mahant, Managing Director at K2 Intelligence Fin, Financial Crimes and Risk Compliance Practice. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and I'm extraordinarily pleased because I have with me Jordan Arnold and Surjeet Mahant, and we're going to take a deep dive into an area that does not get enough play in the broader compliance community, and that is the New York Department of Financial Services and their first cyber enforcement action. Gentlemen, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
I was wondering if we might start out by setting the table of what is the New York State Department of Financial Services? What is its role in both as a regulator and at providing information to companies, banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, commercial organizations that it may regulate, and how does it really sit in the worldwide regulatory scheme?
Sure, Tom. Well, this is Jordan. I'll give a first attempt at an answer there, and I'll begin with just a little bit of history. So New York State historically had departments of banking and insurance, and in 2011, those two departments were effectively merged into a new entity, the Department of Financial Services, which today supervises and regulates the activities of well over 1,000 banking and other types of financial institutions. And then, of course, they also have oversight over, hundreds, if not thousands, of insurance-related entities, from carriers to managed care organizations, individual insurance licensees, and others. And so they have sort of broad regulatory oversight. And by their own word, their mission is to reform the regulation. Obviously in New York State. To keep pace with how things are changing, and to try and be sort of an actor in the prevention effort of financial crises. And then just generally speaking, they, of course, seek to prevent consumers and the broader market from falling victim to frauds and other forms of exposure that can, of course, create long-term consequences both for individuals, for markets, and beyond.
I was wondering if you might give a few words around the work that they've done to put out information about how they view best practices in compliance, particularly around their cybersecurity.
Yeah, well, they've certainly been very proactive in trying to both point to the risks that organizations need to be mindful of and monitor for, and they certainly have recruited some very experienced, skilled leadership, folks who have depths of experience in the relevant areas, so that they can not just essentially come in when something goes wrong to bring obviously a degree of enforcement, but to really try and work with the industry to help stakeholders identify ways to avoid problems in the first place. The idea being that of course both protects those organizations and also the consumers and other individuals who rely upon them. And so it's really not just sort of an organization that exists to kind of, come in and regulate, if you will, and enforce when there's problems, but really to say, look, these are the things that you should be doing to prevent problems in the first place, so that you don't have to deal with the downside of an enforcement action, for example.
So one of the reasons I was so thrilled to be able to visit with the both of you all about this case is for a couple of reasons. Number one, the DFS, although obviously a state regulatory body, really plays on the international stage, and they've been a part of some major international enforcement actions around financial institutions. This case involves an insurance company, which is financial institutions, financial services companies, and insurance companies are all within the DFS remit for regulation. But I think we can take some broader lessons for a wide variety of both private corporations and other types of compliance. So with that, I was wondering if maybe you could give us an overview of the First American Title Company and how we got to where we actually had an enforcement action around this in the United States.
Sure. Well, so DFS, has been at the forefront of identifying the risks associated with obviously cybersecurity, and they, that led to the enactment of what's commonly referred to as Rule 500, which imposed very significant and thoughtful obligations on the entities that it regulates to make sure that those entities are meeting or even exceeding best practices. And the First American matter marks the first enforcement action under Rule 500. And so it's, of course, noteworthy in that way. And certainly DFS took its time in obviously, in putting out its first enforcement action. Of course, the hearing is not scheduled to occur until October, but, the bottom line is that, as has been reported publicly, First American is alleged to have exposed, roughly 885 million records relating to mortgage deals going back all the way to 2003. And what's been alleged is that those documents were available without authentication effectively to anyone with a web browser. So in other words, you would not have to have been a very sophisticated criminal to access that information and, of course, to try and make use of it. And it is alleged to have included, very sensitive personal information about individuals in this country, essentially the raw material that fraudsters and scammers and others use to perpetrate all manner of frauds and crimes. And that includes things like Social Security numbers, bank account numbers, driver's license numbers, and other records. I think what's notable, certainly in this case, and perhaps why it made to the minds of the folks at DFS an appropriate candidate for their first action, is that it appears that the flaw that led to this compromise was introduced through a software update in 2014. And it actually is alleged to have gone undetected until First American had what's known as a penetration test done to look for vulnerabilities, and that was done at the end of 2018. And it seems that although the pen test, as it's known, identified this vulnerability, First American did not take to the mind of DFS the appropriate action to fully remediate that vulnerability, such that large swaths of data remained available after the pen test. And so they have brought this action, saying that, look, if you're an organization like a First American, and so two things really. One, you have to maintain vigilance and understand where your vulnerabilities are, of course, within reason. But it sounds like this was very readily discovered through, what every organization should be doing, among other things, a penetration test. But it's not just enough, of course, to identify what the vulnerability is. You have to take thoughtful and prompt action to remediate those vulnerabilities when they are found. And it does you no good, for example, to classify something as a low-risk vulnerability, as apparently was done here, if in fact it's actively leading to the leakage of very sensitive data about countless consumers. And so I think the action at hand is really aimed at, of course, among other things, drawing attention to the nature of this. The fact that I think you could fairly say that to the minds of DFS, First American should have remediated this vulnerability, much sooner. And again, it just emphasizes the critical importance of doing the risk assessments and doing the other, taking the other actions, the other steps to maintain sort of robust awareness of what your true cybersecurity posture is, so that you can identify the things that perhaps are readily discoverable by third parties. And of course, you never want to have that knock at the door. You want to find it out yourself so that you can take action to correct it, understand what your exposure is, what your obligations are, if any, and move on, stronger than you were before.
If I could pick up on a few of the points that you raised, Jordan, really it seemed to me you walked us through a best practices compliance program in the context of the remediation that should have been done. And it all started with a risk assessment and an updated risk assessment. And what I had not fully appreciated is a simple software update can change your risk profile. Would that be a fair assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, we often read about, breaches and hacking events. And I think that many people tend to associate those types of activities with super sophisticated attackers. The proverbial, guy in the basement, in the dark basement with the hoodie at the keyboard, who's, super skilled, or the nation state attacker, where you have essentially the resources of a country being brought to bear on a targeted attack. The practical reality is that so many of the compromises that we read about and that lead to extraordinary damage are not a function of super sophisticated compromises, or, for example, malicious insiders facilitating access. Really, they are oftentimes a function of, for example, the failure to patch, the failure to routinely update software that may have vulnerabilities. And of course, the providers of those software, they put out patches so that known security flaws, for example, can be fixed. And understanding, what an organization's patching cycle looks like and how, regularly and promptly they're implementing those patches is critical to understanding, again, what your overall cybersecurity posture is. Misconfigurations, simply not using technology in the way or in the optimized way that it's intended to be used can also present manifest opportunity for attackers to take advantage of an organization. And then, of course, there's third-party risk, which is, certainly coming into much sharper focus the more we read about breaches that are a function not of a core vulnerability at the entity that gets breached, but rather a vulnerability at a third party that's able to connect to the network infrastructure of the victim company, if you will, the company that suffers the breach, because their third party had a vulnerability and they did not do the appropriate vigilance. They didn't maintain appropriate vigilance, rather, around how their critical third parties were protecting, for example, the data that's being shared with them or the access that's being provided to them. And so they wind up getting compromised because of those third parties. And so, whether it's failure to patch, whether it's misconfigurations, whether it's third party risk, or even whether it's, companies that make sizable investments in technology and cybersecurity technology, but don't do it in a strategic way. And instead they do one-offs, and they don't sort of put together and maintain a holistic program. These are not sort of set it and forget it type efforts. You can't just buy the technology, turn it on, and leave it. You have to maintain constant vigilance. You have to have the right people within the organization, or at least the right third parties supporting the organization, who know how to optimize the use of that technology. And so, these are the things that an organization must do today to try and prevent the kinds of things that we're talking about and that we read about. The good news is they're quite readily doable. Obviously, many small and mid-sized businesses cannot afford to have in-house the type of talent and reach and breadth, if you will, of coverage. And so for that reason, there are managed services available in the market to bring a level of expertise and coverage to businesses that can't afford to insource in these areas. But that's what needs to be done, because not investing in prevention. We say this to clients all the time. I mean, this is nothing new. Risk assessments have been part of the business forever. They're not unique to cybersecurity, of course. And the idea is that, you need to understand what your risk posture is so that you can try and prevent harm. And of course, investing in prevention is always a fraction of the cost of paying for recovery.
So I was wondering if we might be able to take a step back to actually take a little bit higher level view with your thoughts on what this might mean, sort of broader consequences for the industry, and really the significance of this first enforcement action around the insurance industry.
Well, I think it's an important moment in time. I think that, considering that Rule 500 has been out now for several years, it was, of course, only a matter of when, not if, there would be the first enforcement action. And I think that, I think you can fairly say that we have now entered the enforcement era of Rule 500. And so organizations that have been taking a wait-and-see approach to understand, what the enforcement environment might look like under Rule 500 now have a very clear and I think powerful example of what could be brought to bear. It's worth mentioning, of course, that every single violation under this rule can carry with it a $1,000 fine. And so in the aggregate, that can be not only a game changer, but effectively a business ender, if you will, for certain companies that may not simply be able to recover from the obligations associated with being found to have not been compliant or to have been in violation. So the consequences are very real. I think it's not an overstatement to say that they could pose an existential threat to a business, frankly, of any size, but especially smaller and mid-sized businesses. The DFS regulation, again, it's been looked to by others as a model. Certainly you could fairly say that it's a very thoughtful piece of regulation that obviously, has gained the respect of other regulators as they try to grapple with these issues and put together their own policies and procedures. We've entered, a new era as relates to cybersecurity enforcement in New York State.
And could I take that last point and really move the conversation to a little bit broader than simply this enforcement action or this enforcement action, and have you guys discuss how cyber has become a part of the broader compliance conversation? I've done a lot of podcasts during the time of coronavirus, and a key theme has been the increased risk around cyber, but also the increased compliance. So I was wondering what your thoughts might be along those lines.
Yeah, I can take that, Tom. This is Surjeet. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we are in a new normal, and the entire landscape of cyber is evolving alongside with what we are seeing in the ecosystem right now. The perimeter, as conventionally was thought to be the security aspect of things, has really reduced down to individual laptops and desktops and mobile devices. Right? That's really what it comes down to. And as Jordan was saying earlier on, it's the weakest link, and it could be as simple as a misconfiguration. It could be as simple as a missed patch on a device that can lead to catastrophic issues. From the smallest to the largest organizations. And we see that day in and day out, right? If you think about it, cybercrime is supposed to be the most common types of economic crimes that's out there. I was just looking at some numbers, and, it's estimated to cost the global economy an estimate of about $400 billion annually, right? That's staggering. And again, if you look at the weakest link, it would come down to the smallest of things. And that is indicative of what's happening in the environment today, especially as it relates to the banks and the financial institutions. On one hand, you have the drive to take advantage of the mobile cloud, social media, and any kind of technological trends that are out there. And at the same time, there is, you have to innovate quickly, you have to deliver it faster, reduce the IT complexities. All of this while doing, an airtight security and digital privacy uh, delivery, right, that the consumers of today have come to expect. Now, as convenient as it may sound, it brings a lot of compliance-related overheads, right, and compliance-related requirements. And I think NYDFS has done an excellent job in reinforcing that, and making sure that people understand. So not only is it putting out, a regulatory requirement in a sense, but it's also putting out guidance on how you can do it. And to Jordan's point earlier on, he touched on assessments and things of that nature. These are, relatively simple things that can be done, and to alleviate the issues as far as the cybersecurity is concerned. But cyber is really an underpinning of the entire technology and the business landscape, and you cannot really divorce one from the other, right? So that's really what it comes down to.
Jordan, I was particularly intrigued with your opening remarks about how this case arose and the underlying facts of First American, which led to the breach. And I really wanted to use that to ask you or ask either one of you all about what should a company do when they have notice of a breach? How can they mitigate a violation? That's a key component of really any compliance program. What did you do after you found out about it? What are some of the tactics and strategies that you all might advise a client to engage in?
So I think one of the things that we typically advise our clients on is, they need to stay away from band-aid solutions, pointed solutions. Cybersecurity and compliance has to have a strategic and a programmatic approach to it, right? And it has to be embedded in the DNA of the systems, the application design, the IT infrastructure, the networking. It has to be an inherent part of the entire technology ecosystem in any organization. And that's even more important because if you think about it, it's much more difficult to retrofit compliance and security, rather than have it be a part of the thought process going in, right? So whenever you think about innovation, I think, just naturally, you have to think about security to go along with it. As far as the leadership is an important aspect of that. And, one of the things that we have been seeing, especially with NYDFS calls for a dedicated security leader, right? A CISO. Now, the CISO, a lot of times in the conversations that we've had with financial institutions, especially the smaller ones and the financial services industry, is the cost prohibitive aspect of the security leadership, hiring a dedicated CISO, for example. There are options out there. I mean, the virtual CISO is a new offering that's out there in the industry that reduces your cost of hiring a senior leadership position by 30 to 40% off the bat. And I think that's an extremely, viable option that people are, exposed to and should, in my opinion, consider. You talk about policies, your policies typically is the bar for your compliance within the organization. Now, any sort of regulatory compliance or framework that you talk about, whether it's NYDFS, NIST, ISO, what have you, all of these frameworks come down to how the policies, internal policies have been written and, how they are being enforced and how the efficiency of those policies in terms of their effectiveness of the controls is being tested. So having those robust policies, written out, having them converted into the guidelines and standards is extremely important. It's a very niche area that people need to pay attention to. A lot of times boilerplate policies are the ones that lead into future issues because it's really difficult to retrofit your technological controls into a policy. You need to have a policy that encompasses the larger picture of the security requirements, right? And assessments. I think the risk assessment is such a fundamental thing for the cybersecurity space, and it's really no rocket science, to be honest with you. It's rinse and repeat. You have to have a risk assessment done annually as per the best practices. And, the self-assessments are things that sometimes kind of give you a false sense of security, right? So having a third-party expert come in, look at those assessments, and give you a reality check is extremely important. So that adds value to not only kind of patting yourself on the back, but also being able to get what the industry best practices are, what the peer reviews are, what the threat landscape and the threat vectors are that are evolving in the industry, and just bringing that all to bear and implementing those controls within your environment, right? Simple things like vulnerability management, penetration testing. That was the issue that led to the discovery of the current situation that we started to talk about. I mean, these are, really simple and mandatory things that need to be addressed from the security domain's perspective. And at the end of the day, security is everybody's job. You cannot overplay the aspect of security awareness training, especially phishing, right? Phishing is probably one of the biggest threat vectors that we have seen out there that is so easy to exploit. And what it comes down to is ensuring that every single individual in the organization, big or small, is aware of what it means and how it exposes not just themselves, but the entire organization. And these are learnings that they can take back home, and they can apply to their home network, especially in the times that we are going through with the pandemic. A remote working virtual environment is the new normal. You have brought the office to your home, and therefore you are going to take your risk back to the office if you keep yourself exposed. So these are simple things I feel, I don't want to underplay them by calling them simple, but I feel these are pretty straightforward issues, that can probably avoid a breach, but also kind of a stitch in time, if you will.
I might say it's a simple program, but it may not be easy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes structure like anything else, right? It takes structure, it takes discipline, it takes rigor to be able to put all of this in place. And I might be coming at it from a bias of having to do this day in and day out. So I'll have to say that. But essentially, a strategic programmatic approach to cybersecurity is inherently going to improve your compliance posture. That's for sure.
I've had the chance to visit with several of your colleagues in other types of compliance, financial crimes compliance, export control compliance, and a corruption compliance. And I always try to ask, what do you guys see from the regulators, both now and in the time of, and now in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, but also in the future around regulations and enforcement in the cyberspace that you both play in?
So I'll take a stab at it, and I'll let Jordan talk about it as well. But I think, one word, heightened scrutiny. The regulations have been kind of a checkbox in the past, and we are now in a world that's so fast evolving, and the landscape is changing day in and day out. And, it's really important for these enforcement actions, for the scrutiny to be increased in a way that it becomes, almost a mandatory requirement for people and organizations to consider or reconsider their situation with the cybersecurity aspect. So I think, it's going to change the entire culture of how we look at compliance. The tone from the top is very important from a leadership perspective. A lot of times we see there being a struggle between what the IT wants, what the information security officer wants, versus what the leadership wants, right? And that has somehow they have to come to the table and be able to realistically look at the landscape and the risk appetite that they have. Because one of the things that organizations tend to struggle with is the ROI, right? Tangible returns on investment. And unfortunately, it's an insurance policy. There may not necessarily be a tangible return that is quantifiable, at least, unless there's a very deep work that's done in kind of understanding what the dollar value of a breach is. And a lot of companies are not mature enough to do that. So they have to understand and weigh the risks versus, the advantages of having a good cybersecurity posture and being in compliance. And compliance, to be honest with you, and I'll stop with this, compliance is the difference between staying in business or being out of it.
Jordan, do you have any final thoughts for us?
I would just say that on that point about COVID-19 and the current crisis, I think that as we've seen organizations sort of transform what business as usual looks like, largely migrating to remote workforces, and it's seeming to be the case that even once we're sort of out and beyond the core crisis, that arrangement will continue. At some companies, probably to an enormous extent. At other companies, to a varying extent. The bottom line is that unfortunately, it introduces yet another obligation to to organizations to make sure that the ways in which they make remote connectivity available to their employees is still sort of cybersecurity compliant, if you will, and so that they are not introducing vulnerability by allowing employees to remotely connect, and that they're actually understanding what their risk posture is as relates to remote connections, just as they understand how those connections work within, for example, an office environment. And so while many organizations have had long-standing ability for employees to connect remotely, obviously when you're doing it at scale, that introduces complications that need to be addressed from a security perspective. And when you incorporate that into your steady state operation, again, it also calls for taking a very close look at how you're managing the security of those connections. And, just picking up on something, Surjeet mentioned, we talk all the time with clients who come to us and have, for example, internal IT. And those IT folks are also tasked with effectively looking after cybersecurity. And the fact of the matter is that those are very different jobs and functions, and there's even a tension between them in that IT folks are traditionally focused on network uptime, user access, convenience, and the smooth operation of an organization's network environment. The cybersecurity folks, they're focused on making sure that all those things are happening, but they're happening in a safe and secure manner as best as is possible. And that may mean, for example, that when a vulnerability is detected, that network uptime can be impacted. But that's what they need to do to protect the organization, and that is why the organizations that do this the best, if you will, have not only those roles separated, but they also have them reporting, directly up, as opposed to, for example, a cybersecurity professional reporting into, let's say, a CIO. You don't want to have that type of situation because it does not provide for the optimal protection of an organization. And so, it's really critical that, again, whether it involves making internal hires at the organizations that can afford to do so, or making sure that the right third-party experts are put in a position to maintain a level of vigilance over an organization, you just want to make sure that you're not just saying, for example, our IT team has that covered when it comes to cybersecurity. Because, again, it's not a knock on them, but they have a very different job effectively. And to try and task them with both doing their job and at the same time protecting the organization from a security perspective, given what a different function that is, it's really not fair to them, and it's certainly not in the interests of the organization, its people, and the folks who rely upon them.
Gents, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I wanted to thank the both of you because the First American case obviously is significant because it's the first case, and also a broader overview of the parts and components of a cybersecurity compliance program and where the regulators may take us. I hope that perhaps in the future I might be able to come back to you when we get the next enforcement action.
We'll be here.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I'm running a couple of special series I'd like to visit with you about that I hope you'll listen to. The first one is a series on Wirecard and the accounting fraud fallout from that goes out every Wednesday that I'm doing with Mikhail Ryder-Gordon, Managing Director at Affiliated Monitors. The second is this month in September on the Compliance Live, I have Deanna Wankwo, who is a former CCO, and she talks about her journey to the CCO chair and some of her experiences in joining it. Deanna has perhaps the most unique compliance background of anyone I know. She was in QA/QC at NASA before she moved to the company where she became CCO. So it's a great story. I know you'll get a lot out of it. The Compliance Life has become an incredibly popular series, so check it out. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.